Last summer, I put out a video commemorating the 10th anniversary of Phantasy Star Online 2 that made some waves within the community. It was a fun deep dive on the game, covering everything from its early development to where it was in the summer of 2022. The Phantasy Star franchise itself celebrated its 35th anniversary that year. Grab your monomates, or even your diamates, and let's explore just how we got from this to this. My name's Zio, and I'll be your lore keeper. Our tale begins in the mid-80s. The Japanese video game market was still going strong, while Nintendo breathed new life into that market in the US. Meanwhile, in Japan, a new style of game was rising in popularity thanks to RPGs like Ultima and Wizardry, but these games were on PCs and not very approachable to the average home console gamer. That all changed in 1986 when an obscure real estate company turned video game publisher called Enix released a little something that would make its mark on the industry for decades to come. That little gem was called Dragon Quest for the Famicom, which overseas fans would come to know as the Nintendo Entertainment System. Dragon Quest was a much more streamlined experience than its Western PC counterparts and made all the more special with the visual style of Akira Toriyama. The success of Dragon Quest and its sequel the following year would kick off the Japanese RPG gold rush. Of course, SEGA felt the need to make an RPG of their own for their Mark III, aka the Master System, to establish themselves in this emerging market. The Master System was more powerful than the Famicom, but SEGA only had 10% of the market share at the time. SEGA would put their best and brightest to work on this new RPG in early 1987. Yuji Naka and Kotaro Hayashida were rising stars within the company at the time. Hayashida was known for his work on Alex Kidd, while Naka was responsible for porting several arcade titles like Space Harrier. Both men expressed interest in working on an RPG. Once the duo had the green light from the higher-ups, they put together a team of around 10 people. Hayashida served as lead designer and scenario writer, while Naka was the lead programmer. The team would include fellow Alex Kidd alumni Rieko Kodama and Tokuhiko Uwabo. Kodama designed most of the art for the game, including characters and world maps. This would also be Naoto Oshima's first project with SEGA. The story of Phantasy Star was the brainchild of Chieko Aoki, who had already been working on a story of her own and had most of the dialogue finished before joining the team. Tokuhiko Uwabo would compose around 20 musical tracks that would match the tone of each area in the game. Miki Morimoto, aka Gamer Miki, was in charge of balancing and playtesting. Yuji came up with the name from a song that came out around that time called Beachside Fantasy by pop idol Noriko Sakai. The PH spelling was done to give the game less of a medieval fantasy feel. Believe it or not, it's actually an archaic spelling of the word that we all know. The team had the creative freedom to make the game how they saw fit with a whopping 4 megabit cartridge, which was really big for that time. They still had to make some compromises though. For example, they had planned on 4 planets, but that number had to be brought down to 3. Phantasy Star would set itself apart by bucking the medieval swords and sorcery trend established by other RPGs at the time. The setting was an interesting fusion of sci-fi and fantasy that took several design cues from Star Wars, including guns and lightsabers. The game's dungeons were 3D mazes inspired by Western dungeon crawlers such as Wizardry. This was a feat that many thought impossible on 8-bit hardware, but Yuji Naka's programming chops made this happen. On December 20th, 1987, Phantasy Star would hit store shelves in Japan just 2 days after Final Fantasy for the Famicom. The game was brought to North American and European audiences the following year, making it the first Japanese RPG to reach Western shores before even Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy. The game was ported to the Mega Drive in 1994 in Japan, but the FM sound was removed. Phantasy Star takes place in the Algol star system, nestled deep in the Andromeda Galaxy. Its 3 planets, Palma, Motavia, and Dazorus, each have their own unique culture, climate, and geography. The 3 planets are controlled by a corrupted king named Lassik, or Lashik if you prefer. Our story begins with a young woman named Elise Landale witnessing the murder of her brother Nero by Lassik's forces. Nero tells Elise that she needs to find a man named Odin to help her put an end to Lassik's ambitions. Along the way, Elise meets a cat named Meow, who also has ties to Odin. The final member of the team is an Esper named Noah. Our heroes travel across Algol's 3 planets, meeting several interesting characters along the way. Eventually, they would confront the once benevolent king of Algol and discover that something far more sinister was pulling his strings. And that something was the very embodiment of evil, Dark Falls. A number of changes were made in the localization, such as item and character names. Elise, for example, was called Elisa, Odin was Tyrone, and Noah was Lutz. Phantasy Star received glowing praise from gaming publications of that time. Critics praised the game for its incredible graphics, sound, and storytelling. Others found the game hard to recommend because of its steep price point of around $70 due to its chip size and the save battery. On top of that, there was an industry-wide chip shortage brought on by the popularity of home computers. The game drew praise for helping define the RPG genre and introduce Japanese RPGs to Western fans. The genre wouldn't become mainstream in the West until nearly a decade later, though. By all accounts, Phantasy Star broke every mold imaginable at the time. Besides its steep price tag, the game also had an issue with its ability to save anywhere. While this feature was convenient, it was something of a dual-edged sword. It wasn't uncommon for players to save in the middle of a dungeon only to get stuck in an unwinnable fight, forcing them to start the game all over again. Phantasy Star may not have broken any sales records, but it did well enough for SEGA's market share at the time. In 1988, the team set to work on a direct sequel to Phantasy Star initially planned for the Master System. Around that time, SEGA was getting ready to launch the Mega Drive in Japan, which North American fans would come to know as the Genesis. Development was shifted over to the new hardware, and the team had just 6 months to finish the whole project. Of course, this meant several changes had to be made. For example, the 3D mazes from the first game were replaced with traditional top-down dungeons. The ability to save anywhere was also removed in response to complaints about saving in a bad spot and having to start over again. RPGs of that era had no shortage of random encounters, and Phantasy Star II was most notorious for this. The original story of Phantasy Star II was rather different from the one that we'd ultimately get. The original plan was to have Lutz from the first adventure as the main character, but Yuji Naka felt that his personality was underdeveloped and would have made for a bland protagonist. Phantasy Star II takes place 1,000 years after the events of the first adventure. Algol has entered an age of peace after the exploits of Elise and friends. The once desolate planet Motavia has been terraformed into a verdant paradise, and Algol was under the auspices of a computer called Mother Brain. A young man named Rolf has a recurring nightmare about a woman fighting against an evil demon. Rolf is a government agent in Motavia's capital of Paseo, living with a humanoid bio-monster called Nay. Their first task is to investigate the surge in bio-monster activity on Motavia, and they're eventually joined by 6 others. Things begin to take a dark turn as the story unfolds, and Rolf would come to learn of his past and uncover the secrets of Algol, including a fiend from ages past. Phantasy Star II was released in March of 1989, just a few months after the launch of the Mega Drive in Japan. North American fans would see it in March of 1990, while European fans had to wait a few more months. RPGs were still very new in the West, so a 110-page hint book was included, complete with dungeon maps and lists of items and enemies found throughout the course of the game. Phantasy Star II underwent several changes during localization. Several party members had their names changed to accommodate for their text boxes only having 4 characters. For example, the main character's name in Japan was Usus, but that was changed to Rolf. Dark Falls was also renamed Dark Force, a name that would stay in the next 2 installments. The Esper Lutz is also the same Lutz who traveled with Elise in the first adventure, but this connection was lost in translation due to the name change. There's also the musician Ustvestia, who teaches the music technique. He charges less for male characters because he thinks they look cute. In the English version, he just says they look smart. The game also established several of the naming conventions that would still be used to this day. Just like its predecessor, Phantasy Star II was heavily praised by gaming publications of its time. Dragon Magazine called it one of the best role-playing games yet to be released for any video game system. Computer Gaming World called it a system seller, going on to state that the 16-bit graphics are gorgeous, but the real fun lies in the science fiction story plot. In later years, people have still sung its praises, calling it a game of many firsts. But in 1990, things would take a rather interesting turn.
SEGA はロールプレイングゲームも変えてしまう。ファンタシースター。かつてない驚異のグラフィック。壮大な SF ストーリー。その秘密は4メガ。ファンタシースター。16ビット6メガ。セガファンタシースター2。目を見張るリアルキャラクター。ツインスクロール。メガドライブ対応未体験ロールプレイングゲーム。ファンタシースター2。
In 1990, Sega was facing a tremendous uphill battle against Nintendo, who was dominating the home console market on both sides of the Pacific. Meanwhile, Nintendo was readying the Super Famicom alongside its marquee title Super Mario World. Sega felt they needed their own mascot character, one that could go toe-to-toe with Super Mario. So they held a company-wide design contest for this new mascot, and the winning design came from Naoto Oshima, a character called Mr. Needlemouse, or Mr. Hedgehog. Sega put their best and brightest to work on this project, which included Oshima and several other members of the Phantasy Star team. That team would spend 1990 and 1991 creating what the world would come to know as Sonic the Hedgehog. This would put Phantasy Star III in a rather odd position. It was made by a team who had no prior experience with Phantasy Star, with the exception of Hiroto Saiki, better known as S2. Saiki's team consisted of Golden Axe alumni, including composer Izuho Numata aka Ippo. The final product was a stark departure from its predecessors. Phantasy Star II had a distinct sci-fi manga style with bright and sharp colors. In contrast, Phantasy Star III had a more medieval style with softer muted colors, much like Golden Axe. Combat was similar to the first two games, but things were simplified with pictographs. Players who were strong enough could turn on auto battle, which reduced some of the tedium of grinding. The music also changed depending on how well the party was doing over the course of the fight. The overworld music also changed based on the side of the party, adding a new layer for each new member. The story of Phantasy Star III is set sometime after the events of Phantasy Star II. There's a mass evacuation from the planet Palma, and 400 domed ships are deployed in search of a new home. Of course, Dark Falls follows them and destroys all but two, the Elisa III and the Neo Palma. Two factions, one led by the swordsman Arachio, the other by the sorceress Laia, were embroiled in a bloody civil war for control over the world. But one day, Arachio and Laia both disappeared. Even long after the war, the two factions would still be at odds with each other, each blaming the other side for their leader's disappearance. The game starts with an Arachian prince named Reese, set to marry a young woman named Maya, who he found washed up on the shore nearby. The story follows Prince Reese and his descendants across 3 generations. The adventure had branching paths based on who the player chose to marry, and had 4 different endings based on these choices. This was an innovative idea by early RPG standards, much like how the first 2 installments introduced ideas that would become RPG staples over the years. Phantasy Star III, Successors of Time, was released on April 21, 1990 in Japan, and overseas the following year as Generations of Doom. Gaming publications of the day sang its praises for its graphics and its story. Computer Gaming World called it a rewarding epic tale that should be told on every Genesis. The Generation system was also lauded for giving the game added replay value. But if you had your ear to the ground on the internet over the years, you would see some very different responses. You'll see labels such as Black Sheep or Not a Real Phantasy Star thrown around. These labels mostly stemmed from the fact it wasn't made by the same team and that it didn't take place on Algol. As for not being made by the same team, game sequels are made by different teams than their predecessors all the time, and they don't get anywhere near as much heat as this one. As for being set in Algol, the game does make that connection, albeit later on. There is mention of Dark Falls, aka Dark Force, early on though. Phantasy Star III was also the first appearance of what would become the series mascot, the Rappy. By the end of 1992, the first 2 Sonic games were out the door and the home console wars had begun to shift in Sega's favor, in the States at least. The first news of Phantasy Star IV would come in late 1992, and Electronic Gaming Monthly would be among the first to cover it. Phantasy Star IV was planned for the SEGA CD and would feature animated cutscenes and bring back the dungeon mazes that were popular in the first adventure. But things would change and development was shifted over to a 16 megabit cartridge. This of course meant the mazes were on the chopping block and the animated cutscenes were replaced by comic panels. But as development progressed, that cartridge size was increased to 24 megabits. Several members of the original Phantasy Star team would come back, with Rieko Kodama being placed in the director's chair. Phantasy Star IV was a return to the series' roots both in terms of presentation and storytelling. The team would pull out all the stops for what would be a swan song for the series. Combat was much like the previous titles, but this time players could set up macro commands which allowed them to execute powerful combination attacks. Battles also took place while traveling aboard vehicles, which was an idea from Phantasy Star II that had to be shelved. The story takes place after the events of Phantasy Star II, a calamity that would come to be known as the Great Collapse. 90% of Algol's population died off, ushering in a dark age. The survivors of this calamity would slowly recover and rediscover old knowledge. Phantasy Star IV begins on Motavia with a renowned hunter named Alice and her apprentice Chaz, known as Lila and Rudy in the Japanese version. Chaz is now officially her partner, and the duo's first mission is to investigate a den of monsters in the basement of the local academy. However, this was part of a cover-up that would be traced back to a mysterious cult leader named Zio. That's Zio with an I, by the way, not to be confused with yours truly. Along the way, Chaz is joined by an eclectic cast of characters, including a native Dazorian, for a total of 11 playable characters. Chaz and company would come to discover that Dark Falls was the one behind everything happening, in addition to pulling Zio's strings. Our heroes would learn about Algol's origins as well as the real threat to its existence. Phantasy Star: The End of the Millennium was released in Japan on December 17, 1993. The game made its way to North America in February of 1995 and then in Europe later that year. Did this really happen? Did SEGA manage to bring all 4 mainline titles of its RPG franchise to both Japan and the West? Something that Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest had yet to do at the time? Well, yes. While this may not sound like much by today's standards, this was a pretty big deal in the early to mid-90s. Don't forget, RPGs were dialogue heavy and they took much longer to localize than any other game. On top of that, they were always the most expensive, so localizing one of these was a big gamble. Most RPGs would end up selling fewer units than other games that were easier to localize. Oftentimes, localizations were cancelled before release, if not skipped over altogether. Phantasy Star IV sold for almost $100 in 1995, which is worth around $200 as of February 2023. Critics at the time gave the game high marks for its story, sound, and visuals. They also liked the convenience of the macro system. One common critique is that it didn't feel too different from its predecessors. The fans have been much kinder to this game than its predecessor over the years, hailing it as the best in the classic series. A stark contrast from what's been said about the previous entry. There were also a handful of Japan-exclusive spin-off titles. Phantasy Star II Text Adventure was a series of text adventures released on Sega's Meganet service between 1990 and 1991. These were 8 side stories involving the cast of Phantasy Star II before they came together. Phantasy Star Adventure was released on the Game Gear in 1982. It was a first-person puzzle game involving an agent from Paseo who was sent to Dazores to investigate what happened to his missing friend. Phantasy Star Gaiden on the Game Gear was also released in 1992. It follows the events of Phantasy Star I on a world colonized by Elise after leaving Algol. The first 4 titles have seen several ports across multiple console generations. The first 2 games were remade as part of the Japan-exclusive Sega Ages 2500 series during the 2000s. These enhanced remakes featured updated graphics and revised combat. They also fleshed out a number of story elements that weren't present in the originals. Phantasy Star Generation 1 was released in 2003, while Generation 2 was released 2 years later. The 4th entry was planned to receive this treatment, but those plans were unfortunately scrapped. Generations 1 and 2 were translated into English thanks to a few devoted fans. The first game was ported to the Nintendo Switch in 2018, adding several quality of life features. Aside from a collection disc on the Saturn in 1998, the series would go dormant until 2000.
時を司るのは神か悪魔か一本で4つのエンディングキングオブ RPG 時の継承者ファンタシースターIII 時を司るのは神か悪魔か。1本で4つのエンディングが楽しめるキングオブ RPG 時の継承者ファンタシースター3発売記念ダブルキャンペーン実施中。
光と闇の最後の戦いが今始まろうとしている。スペースバトルストーリーファンタシースター The End of the Millennium。 惑星ファルマの消滅から1000年、光と闇の最後の戦いが今始まろうとしている。Battle Story Phantasy Star The End of the Millennium from Mega Drive SEGA。
The rise in popularity of online gaming on PCs would set the industry on fire in the West at the turn of the century. Japan, however, was another story, where consoles were still king. SEGA chairman Isao Okawa recognized this emerging trend and wanted a flagship online game for the upcoming Dreamcast. This Herculean task fell to Sonic Team and its frontman Yuji Naka, since no other development team at SEGA wanted the job. When Okawa fell ill, Naka would send progress reports to the hospital. This was still uncharted territory for the Japanese market, so the team looked to Western games for inspiration. During development, Naka studied Diablo, EverQuest, and Ultima Online. He was impressed by Diablo's fluid combat despite requiring significant system memory. A full-fledged MMO was off the table since the Dreamcast had no internal storage to support continuous patches. On top of that, building the necessary server infrastructure would have taken at least a couple years. PSO initially had the working title of Third World, but when Naka saw the concept art of a dragon by Satoshi Sakai, it reminded him of Phantasy Star. Naka had always wanted to make a multiplayer Phantasy Star game, but hardware limitations made this impossible. While PSO had the Phantasy Star name, it had no ties with its predecessors, which gave the team much more creative freedom. Of course, series staples like Meseta, techniques, and certain items were still there. The story centers around the planet Ragol, which is discovered by a refugee vessel named Pioneer 1 in an effort to evacuate their homeworld. After setting up shop on Ragol, Pioneer 2 is deployed, but a massive explosion happens just as Pioneer 2 makes contact with the other settlers. The player assumes the role of a mercenary given the task of investigating what happened on Ragol. Phantasy Star Online was released on December 21, 2000 in Japan, and January of 2001 in North America, with a European release the following month. Since Japanese internet service providers charged for dial-up access by the minute, Japanese Dreamcasts were bundled with a year of free internet access on the house, courtesy of Isao Okawa himself. Japanese players still had to pay a monthly subscription to play online though. The game allowed players from across the globe to team up and communicate with a feature called Word Select. In the summer of 2001, an updated version called Version 2 was released. This added several new items and features to the game, including battle and challenge modes. Version 2 was ported to Windows PCs in Japan near the tail end of 2001. After Sega's exit from the console business in 2001, PSO was ported to the GameCube and Xbox. These added new items and new areas, plus 3 new classes. Phantasy Star Online Episode 3, Card Revolution, was released on the GameCube in 2003, and in the West the following year. Instead of the hack-and-slash format, gameplay was more akin to popular collectible card games of the time. In 2004, PSO was again brought to Windows under the name Blue Burst, and featured a whole new set of areas and a new story dubbed Episode 4. The game was online only and character data was stored server-side to cut down on cheating. It was released in June of 2005 in North America, but it was separated from the Japanese servers. PSO was an important milestone, as it was the first online console RPG. It was a major proof of concept for other much bigger endeavors like Final Fantasy XI and Final Fantasy XIV. While the official retail servers are long gone, devoted fans have managed to keep the game alive through private servers. In 2006, Phantasy Star Universe made its debut on the PlayStation 2 and PC, as well as the Xbox 360. PSU's Japanese launch was a rocky one, having only one closed beta test. The game was more popular than SEGA had expected, selling 100,000 units within the first week. There were 5 times more registered accounts than what their servers were equipped to handle. The service had to be shut down within 48 hours of going live, followed by a full character wipe after reports of item duplication had surfaced. The servers came back up several days later, but things were still touch and go for that first month. Japan was roped off from everyone else for PC and PS2 service, but everyone could play together on Xbox 360. PSU is set in the Goral solar system made up of 3 planets, each with their own distinct geography and governments. Goral is protected by a private security force called the Guardians. The offline story campaign has its own set of protagonists. There was also voice acting in the story, which featured several popular Japanese voice actors. An expansion was released in 2007 called Ambition of the Illuminous, which introduced several new mechanics and weapons. There was also a trio of spin-off titles released for the PSP. PSU received mixed reviews from Western critics, while Famitsu gave the game a 36 out of 40. The online mode had several issues, especially on the international side. Cheating and crashes were rampant, plus content was several months behind the Japanese servers. Just like with PSO, fans have managed to preserve the game through private servers. Phantasy Star Zero was released on Christmas Day of 2008 in Japan, and overseas the following year on the Nintendo DS. SEGA chose the DS to expand the series to younger audiences. It was given the name Zero to signify a new start for the series. The game took elements from PSO and PSU and expanded on them. The game had its own offline story campaign with 3 main paths based on the character's race, but they all came together in the end. Critics of the day had somewhat mixed responses to the game. Famitsu praised it for its simple controls and fast-paced action, going on to say that it felt like an online game in the palm of your hand. Nintendo Power praised the combat and the story, but felt the user interface was difficult to navigate. Zero would be among the last new Phantasy Star titles to see a Western release in nearly a decade.
SEGA ネットゲームねえ、繋がってみない？はい。すごいんだから。ねえ、繋がろう。いきなりそんな。ネットゲームでみんながすごくなる。世界ネット RPG ファンタシースターオンライン。命をかけてシードと戦っているんだよ。もっと強くなれ。でも君の魂を揺さぶるのはドラマだけじゃない。ファンタシースターユニバース、すべての RPG を過去にするセガ。居酒屋、セクシー、ツーリング、温泉。でも君の心を躍らせるのはそれだけじゃない。ファンタシースターユニバース、すべての RPG を過去にするセガ。
2012 saw the release of Phantasy Star Online 2 in Japan on Windows PCs. The game would make its way onto the PlayStation Vita and eventually the PS4 and Nintendo Switch. PSO2 was entirely free to play, which was seen as a bold move considering it was in development for about as long as some full-price AAA titles. An international release with its own servers was announced a few days after the Japanese launch, but those plans fell through. Sega's overseas branches didn't have the logistical backbone at the time to support a game of that magnitude on par with Japan. After years of radio silence, Western fans finally did get that official release with Microsoft's help. The North American release of PSO2 began on Xbox One and later PC via the Windows Store. It would later come to Steam and the Epic Games Store. Between 2012 and 2020, PSO2 would have its own set of spin-off titles. Phantasy Star Online 2S was a mobile game released in the spring of 2014. It also served as a companion app for PSO2 proper that was never released outside of Japan. Phantasy Star Nova was released in 2014 for the PlayStation Vita. Nova was developed by Tri-Ace, whom RPG fans will no doubt know for their work on Valkyrie Profile and Star Ocean. In November of 2018, Idola Phantasy Star Saga made its debut on iOS and Android devices in Japan. Idola was set in the fantastical world of Vandor sometime after the events of PSO2's story. The swords and sorcery atmosphere was a drastic departure from PSO2's sci-fi atmosphere. Unlike the other two, this one did release outside of Japan. On June 9th, 2021, Phantasy Star Online 2, New Genesis would take the game in a different direction. While the original PSO2 involved exploring different planets with instanced areas, NGS took place on a single open world that players could freely explore. The world was broken off into 4 distinct regions released over the course of 18 months, each with their own distinct geography and climate. During the game's launch, it was more popular than ever, and Phantasy Star brand awareness was at an all-time high. But as with any MMO launch, that honeymoon phase didn't last long. While many felt the game had an enjoyable foundation, most players breezed through everything the game had to offer at launch within a week. On top of that, NGS was missing several important quality of life features that were in the base game. The players were not happy with how the game was progressing and weren't exactly shy about expressing their discontent. Over the ensuing months, SEGA would bring back the missing quality of life features as well as other gameplay elements in between major updates. By December 2022, all 4 regions were made available and the game was starting to feel like a more complete package. But some fans weren't entirely satisfied, especially when it came to the game's narrative. One major grievance aired by the community is the lack of agency of our playable character being relegated to no more than the proverbial wind beneath everyone else's wings. The next major update, dubbed Ultra Evolution, is slated for June and is said to be the largest update yet. Will this be enough to attract new players and restore the faith of longtime fans? Only time will tell. The Phantasy Star series has no shortage of secrets and lore, and not just within the games themselves. While longtime Phantasy Star literati might know most of this stuff, the newer folks might not. What if I told you Algol was real? Would you believe that some characters were named after real people? No, really. There's an actual Algol star system nestled within our neighboring galaxy, Andromeda. The 2 main stars orbit each other while the third one orbits them, just like the 3 planets. Algol was associated with war, violence, and death in many cultures. It was also nicknamed the Demon Star. What if I told you the classic series had 2 different timelines depending on what version you were playing? In the English version, the chronology of events was 1, 2, 3, and 4. Makes sense, right? Well, 3 and 4 happen around the same time. But in the original Japanese version, it goes something like 1, 2, 4, and then 3. The main antagonists in episode 4 of PSO2 were named after famous authors. For example, Eritron Tolstoy shares his last name with 19th century Russian author Leo Tolstoy. PSO2 New Genesis has several musical Easter eggs from previous games scattered throughout its world. Have you found them all?
中世ファンタジー新クラスヒーローの登場。これが進化を続ける伝説の RPG PSO2 基本無料。待ってるよ。ねえ、一緒に行こう。またてか水着。ほら早く走って。ちょっと出た新キャラ。待って。私と一緒でしょ。何よ、私と一緒に。PSO2 がスマホでもシンプル操作で爽快なアクションバトル。宇宙が舞台の壮大なストーリーで仲間と共に旅立とう。これがスマートフォンの PSO2、PSO2S。スマホで待ってるよ。
When I began writing this, I didn't really have an epilogue in mind, but since this is an open love letter to Phantasy Star, I decided to turn this last segment over to you guys. Faded Black SS says, PSO on the Dreamcast was my first entry into the series. Funny enough, I grew up a huge FF fan, so when I saw Phantasy Star Online, I thought it was just a cheap knockoff. I'm at GameStop or whatever it was back then with my mom, and she sees PSO for like $10. She grabs it just because she sees the anime aesthetic and knows I like it, even though I didn't want it because of the reasons stated above. I didn't play it for weeks, but boy, when I did, I was hooked. I spent hours rare hunting, doing the well-written side quests, just trying to learn more about the world. I picked up almost every PS-themed game afterwards. So yeah, thanks Mom. T-Quinn TV says, I'll never forget walking out onto that grassy field for the first time. So serene. Drac, Galleon, Zero, and Slade, all of us sitting in dark rooms after work lit by television screens, Dreamcast controllers in hand. Walking up to the obelisk, the peace wouldn't last. We'd found her, Red Ring Rico, only she didn't look anything like the girl we were looking for. This was a moment in gaming that changed me forever. We won, barely, and at a great cost. The principal's daughter wouldn't be going home. To this day, I can't hear the end credits theme without feeling wistful. Artist Dora says, "It might not be a major one, but I remember when they first gave out the Rappies emote and a huge group would impersonate each other and coordinate the dance in the Universal Challenge lobby." Inhenoir PSO2 says, "The memory that stood out to me the most was figuring out and mastering perfect attacks in PSO2. Once you've learned it, the combat from older post-online titles clicks." Homedog X5 says, "The best memories I have come in two parts. The first one is the countless sleepovers playing PSO Episode 1 and 2 couch co-op on the GameCube. My friends and I were so excited when we beat the Gal Griffin in Episode 2 after trying so many times. The second would be all the good times on PSU. A few IRL friends and I started on the demo when we first got Xbox 360s. About 15 years ago on that demo, we met two people while doing a run of Diragon. To this day, they are still regular friends. All of us were the same age and in middle school at the time. We thought it was crazy that our group who lived on the east coast of the US were partying up and playing with people on the west coast. We have all met up in real life, with them even flying out and attending 2 weddings for myself and another of our friends here in Virginia. Our friend group has lasted over 15 years, and when we reminisce, we always come back to our good times on the 4th floor of the Guardians Colony and our time on the Goral system. Oh my goodness, you guys did not make this easy. Some really sweet and funny ones. Now I'll share with you one of mine. It was launch day for the Japanese version of Phantasy Star Universe in August of 2006. I had pre-ordered my copy months in advance. I went to the mailroom that morning to pick it up and immediately raced back to my dorm room to install it on my PC. I don't remember getting much sleep that weekend. It was still fun despite the servers being really unstable at the time. I'd broken up with my girlfriend of over 2 years near the tail end of September that year, and PSU helped keep my mind off of things. These worlds and characters may not be real, but the joy they brought us over the years certainly is. The memories we forged through our countless adventures shall live on inside us forevermore. To better understand who we are and where we're going, we need to understand where we came from. These words ring true, be they in our world or one of fiction. So if you made it all the way here, thank you. Here's to whatever the future holds for the Phantasy Star franchise. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and thank you, Phantasy Star. And remember, to thine own self be true. Until next time, farewell.